Like in the United States, working people in France face the consequences of living under the system of capitalism that exploits our labor for the benefit of those who control the wealth and the productive forces of our society. And faced with this virus, like here, the concern for profit versus the health of the population has made matters even worse. Right now in the United States, COVID-19 has taken over 280,000 lives. And the benefits that came from the CARE Act that were passed in March are about to expire. This includes the expiration on the ban on home evictions, the pause in student loan payments, the end of unemployment benefits for more than 13 million people. The bread lines are already miles long in many places, and we know that to make matters worse, state and city budget cuts are looming ahead of us. So in France, the control that the rich have over the economy and the government takes a different form from here, but we can see similar consequences. Also in France, just like here, the minority that's in power is maintaining its control through force. In the US, we see it in the racist police violence that's captured on cell phones again and again. And when the violence leads to outrage, the way it did most obviously over the murder of George Floyd, we see it once again when the police and the National Guard are called out to protect the so-called law and order in order to control and repress the protests and the rebellions. It is just the same in France as well, as you'll hear from our speakers today. So please note that while we're recording this event, when we put this event on our website, there will be audio but no video. So your faces, if you participate, will not be included in the website video that we create. And first off, today we're going to hear from Gilles, who's a teacher in Paris in the Parisian metropolitan region. And he's going to give us a general overview of the social situation that France is facing now in the second wave of the coronavirus and the situation in the schools. So welcome, Gilles, and you can take over from here.
Hi, everybody. So to begin with, I will present the social and sanitary situation in France. Actually, both are linked to a certain extent. I'll start with the way Macron managed the pandemic and especially the second wave. It's hard to know how it has been described in the US. Maybe it's showed as an example, I don't know. Anyway, it's not. I won't quote many figures, but just one could show that the government wasn't prepared for this second wave. We had around 30,000 deaths after the first wave. Since September, 25,000 people died from COVID, 25,000 more. So Macron spoke a lot on TV, trying to explain what he was doing. But what did he exactly do? In France, we've been experimenting a special light lockdown during 4 weeks. It was light for the bosses, but not for the workers. Now the lockdown is supposed to be even lighter because small businesses are reopening step by step. The next step will take place on December the 50th with a new curfew replacing the lockdown. It should be better. It's hard to understand how the government managed this crisis. We could nevertheless say that Macron's priority was to limit the consequences of the situation on big companies. So let's summarize briefly what the French government did or did not. After a curfew in October and other special sanitary measures that tend to transfer the weight of the sanitary crisis to the population, the government has established this new lockdown in November. Why? Because they failed to control the pandemic. The COVID screening program was literally overwhelmed because of insufficient test capacities. Actually, it was impossible to be tested on time, and in the same time, hospitals were full of COVID patients. Actually, the government tried to do things by half because the bourgeoisie did not want neither to reduce its profits by implementing simple sanitary measures in the workplaces, nor to slow down the economy by any means. So they sent workers to work and pupils to schools without any measures. The government lied, saying that schools and workplaces weren't COVID clusters and explained people were individually responsible for the disease spread. Prime Minister Jean Castex said it many times, people are responsible for the second wave. But in reality, the government health measures were clearly not sufficient to prevent the hospitals from reaching the saturation point. What's more, the government did not think serious for months to hire people in the health system, after having reduced the capacities for years. The comrade will develop this point after me. Nothing was planned after the first wave, despite the protests in hospitals. Nursing staff fled away because of the working conditions and low wages. So Macron finally decided this new lockdown, not the same as the emergency shutdown they carried from March to May, but a kind of selective lockdown during which people were supposed to work in their plants, in their shops or offices, even if the government encouraged companies to implement home working. Schools are opened, so the parents can go to work, but universities are closed. But the rest is more or less forbidden. That is to say, everything except capitalist exploitation. It meant a deeper control on the population. To make sure people obey those rules, the government renewed what it implemented during the first lockdown this spring. A special certificate you have to carry when you leave home to justify why you are outside. During the first 15 days, around 100,000 fines were given to people for being outside with no good justification. Now they don't control people that much, but it's still a way to control people if they want. Those measures tend to irritate people, which is legitimate because the current situation is the consequence of the government's failure, whereas all the restrictions affect workers' everyday life. You must go working on a production line in your plant, but you can't see friends or enjoy free time. Maybe it's the capitalist dream, but it's a difficult time to endure for workers. The shopkeepers are also angry because of the closing of many unessential shops without any help from the government. A closure that gives the opportunity for bigger retail companies to get their market shares bigger, while many businesses are going bankrupt. Big retail companies tried quite successfully actually to use this situation in order to pressure the government to put an end to the restrictions. But now restaurants and bars owners are angry too because they are supposed to remain closed until February. So facing this uncomfortable situation, Macron and his government, they launched a series of counterfires trying to create a diversion. Macron announced a law against what he called separatism that clearly targets the Muslims. It's not new for Macron to use this far-right rhetoric, blaming Muslims for living separately from the Republic. Of course, some Islamist currents try to increase their control on working-class neighborhoods where many immigrants live, or second or third generation immigrants. But Macron's goal is precisely to point the immigrants and to use them as scapegoats. Another kind of separatism, actually, to divide the working class. The first time Macron used that term, it was in February, after the long strike against his pension reform. A few months later, in June, he used the same word, this one not against Muslims, but against the youth, demonstrating against racism and police violence. The law against separatism is supposed to be published in a few days. It's not really clear what it would really change, but the aim is to create a diversion. After the Muslims, Macron and his government launched an attack against migrants, saying migration and terrorism were connected and publicly showed their determination to reduce immigration. 2 weeks ago, for example, the police demolished a migrants camp in Paris, chasing them away to another camp and worse living conditions. A few days later, some of them tried to settle a new camp with tents on a square in Paris, from which they got immediately expelled by the police. That night, the police brutality against migrants was filmed and widely denounced. In the same time, the government proposed a law that would forbid people and journalists to publish images of policemen. After the rising of police violence we faced for a couple of years, for example, during the Yellow Vest movement, the government wants to give to the police the full permission to be violent without being recorded or sued. This launched the protest we will talk about later. This is the atmosphere Macron is currently spreading: racism, xenophobia, and security measures, following the political agenda of the right or the far right. Meanwhile, he gives the bosses exactly what they need to put the working class under pressure and to make us pay for the economic crisis. First, a mass recovery plan for the bosses. After a gift of 470 billion euros during the spring, they will receive another package of 100 billion euros next year. You could imagine the government would ask some bosses to reduce or to postpone layoffs in order just to justify this huge gift of public money. It's not the case. There are absolutely no compensation on the company's side. They can continue the layoffs or wage reduction while they enjoy subsidies. Now some voices rise saying the population will have to pay this debt anyway. Layoffs, mass unemployment, wage reduction, and worsening working conditions. Those are the other side of the bosses' attacks. After the end of the first lockdown, we had a wave of layoffs in small and big companies. For example, the Bridgestone plant in Béthune, a tire factory in northern France, where about 900 workers will be fired. We could quote many other examples. Everywhere, bosses try to reduce their cost and increase exploitation using juridic tools developed by Macron in the last years. So did the workers react so far? How did they react? There were few collective reactions against those layoffs. Some strikes which remained isolated until now, but also interesting attempts to unite the workers who are often isolated in their workplaces. From October to November, many small reactions in the workplaces targeted the pandemic, the lack of measures against the COVID at work, or the difficult working conditions created by the wearing of masks, for example, on a production line. In some car industry plants, some workers went on strike those last weeks to protest against this situation. But another important reaction took place at school, where when some teachers and pupils went on strike to demand better working or studying conditions, that is to say, to split classes or to hire more personnel. This spontaneous movement forced the government to let high school teachers implementing some measures, but not in middle or elementary schools. The strike stopped at that point, but it was seen as a victory for the teachers who succeeded in forcing their directors to accept those measures. What's more, there was something political, I would say, in this movement, because the teachers and pupils opposed directly the government, pointing him as responsible for the disease spread because of insufficient measures. It's much better than denouncing masks as being a tool to muzzle the people and to establish a so-called sanitary dictatorship. This is what some conspiracists say in France. But teachers were asking the administration to make it possible to work and study without risking their lives. Now it's behind us. But this strike and all those small movements may have been a kind of forewarning. The government was stuck in the public health emergency and widely rejected by the majority of the population. Today, the pandemic situation is getting somewhat better. The second wave is over. The light lockdown should be followed by a curfew while we await tests and a vaccine. But we don't forget the death, and many problems are in front of us. The layoffs, the increasing poverty, the situation of the youth, students, for example, who are totally left to their fate without jobs or money. So the atmosphere is strained, not only because people are demonstrating against police violence, but because everybody sees the social crisis is rapidly coming, and many reactions could arise, and they could be hard, not only against Macron or the government, but also against the capitalists he serves. I'm over.
All right. Thank you very much, Gilles, for that report. And now we're going to hear from Laura, who shares my name, but is in another country. She's a nurse in the city of Nantes, and she's going to give us a perspective on the situation in the hospitals. Thank you, Laura.
So what hit our attention as a healthcare worker was the fact that nothing was really prepared by the government for the second wave of COVID. After the struggle of hospital workers that followed the first wave and lockdown, the government just gave us bonuses. But in fact, hospital staff mobilized on many occasions to denounce this catastrophic situation, past, present, and future. Like national strike of emergency services, major demonstrations by staff on all profession and all health sectors as on June the 16th, 2020. In many cities, or the denunciation of the situation by doctors, etc. But on the real problem, the understaffing and therefore the working condition have not changed. No professional training has been offered to hospital employees to acquire more skills and better resist the second wave. Like for several months, colleagues who wish to access to the nursing training school must follow a series of interviews to prove their ability to become nurses. What was in fact answer question made according to protocols that are so far from reality, and there was no more room in the nursing training schools. This is quite a reflection of the more general health situation where the only health policy has been to impose the wearing of masks to everyone, but nothing else was done. There was not even enough vaccines for the usual seasonal flu. 60% of pharmacies in the country are out of stock for flu vaccines, and the goal of the 2021 French Medicare budget is still to seek 4 billion in savings. As a result, 40% of healthcare workers wanted to change jobs since the health crisis. Many have stopped or talking about stopping, and the policy of hospital management is to keep everyone at work. Hospital managers told us, at least the dumbest manager, that we were catching the virus at home, so everyone came to work and couldn't be stopped even when we were infected with the virus. We all contaminated each other, and for example, I have a colleague, contrary to her willingness, who gave it to me. Worse is when we were out of work for medical issues, they imposed us a loss of salary on the first day we were off work. And for the hospital profession who work from home, like the administrative staff, it was a hell of a fight to get the right to stay home safely and to be equipped. So that's how we are treated. And then there are the patients. So those of the COVID, of course, and for all the others, those who were made to take a lot of risks, because in the care units, the COVID patients and the others were mixed. At hospital, it was like a real game of musical beds. It's like we just take patient here to put them somewhere else. But in this situation, we just need more beds and more healthcare workers to take care of the patients. And that is how the nurses think about the situation. And even after the spring demonstration and getting the bonuses, the struggle continued, especially because the government has excluded from the bonuses a certain number of colleagues who fought and are still fighting to get all the bonuses like the others. And those who also wanted to be paid like the other are the nursing students who were mobilized in COVID units and refused to be treated as almost unpaid slave labor. In some places, they managed to get low wages, but wages anyway. Today, the new policy is like they want to use us as guinea pigs for the vaccine, especially in retirement homes. In short, no problem related to the few means allocated to health and hospital has been solved, but today, far fewer people have illusions. So, of course, faced with this situation, as in industry, at a post office, among teachers, people want to try to change jobs and run away, but where? With the unemployment, there won't be 50 exits, and collective fights can, of course, be one of them. And to conclude and maybe give some hope, something that struck me during the health crisis was we had to manage without the managers because they weren't there. They were working from home, living on the weekends. And so we had to take care of our own care. In fact, we had to manage our departments and units based on our professional skills and collective intelligence. In fact, despite the health crisis, it worked much better, and we imposed a form of local control power where we were to organize and reorganize the work according to our needs. And on a very, very small scale, it was a kind of workers' power, or at least an expression of what we want to move towards.
And now we're going to hear from Maria. She's our last speaker today. She's a postal worker in the city of Paris, and she's a shop steward in her post office. She's going to talk about the political situation that has developed just recently. All right, Maria, it's all yours.
Do you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Yes, it's okay? Okay. So I will talk about this movement against police that took place for 2 weeks now. And it's a movement against this law of global, so-called global security. So now, this afternoon, I returned from a demonstration, certainly maybe less huge than the demonstration on Saturday 28, where there was hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. But again, today, there were lots of young people in the street with slogans against the police, and in all France, around 90 demonstrations in the whole country. So we couldn't really finish this demonstration, which was linked to a union demonstrations against unemployment and social insecurity that was planned for a long time. So we couldn't really finish it because, according to the media, there were 500 black blocs provocating the police forces. Police forces which themselves were hundreds and hundreds, and took advantage of this situation to block the demonstrations for hours in the city. So we can say that the government is facing a political crisis, a real one, trying maybe to put discredit on the movement, because in fact there is a great deal of discontent against police violence and more broadly against the increasingly repressive policies of the government. But first, I must explain what made people go demonstrate by hundreds of thousands last week. You saw the image at first in the town hall. So, in order to further strengthen its repressive arsenal and to flatter the police forces, part of which is corrupted by the currents of the extreme right in France, the government proposed a few weeks ago a new bill called the Global Security Bill. Embarrassed by the cell phone videos or journalist videos showing their repressive actions, the police unions requested the possibility of a law allowing them to prosecuting anyone who uses images of police officers with the intention of harming them. The excuse of this filming was that a family of police officers were killed in reprisal in 2018. So this Article 24 of the law, of this new law, is an authorization for any police officer to repress and take into custody those who would film them, journalists included. Although the whole law includes a lot of very dangerous measures to control the population, and especially those who challenge the government, for example, using drones during demonstrations, facial control, real-time exchange of images by the police officers who can film everything, then they can film us. So the possibility for police officers to use their weapons in public places when they are out of duty. It was this Article 24 that motivated the first demonstrators at least. With shelter-in-place measures, active or not, from November 21 on, demonstrations took place in front of the National Assembly in Paris or in provincial towns, called at first by journalists' unions, by human rights activists, lawyers, etc. But at first there were already young people. On November 24, the law was passed by the majority of deputies, those of Macron's party, but also those of the right and the extreme right. The left-wing deputies voted against it, even though the socialist government have contributed just as much to increasing repression in France for the last years. But the situation became explosive after two events that showed police forces in action, and you saw it in the photos. On the night of November 23, following the violent dismantling of a camp where 3,000 migrants were crammed in inhuman conditions in a large suburb of Paris, some of these migrants, with the help of associations, elected officials, and activists, planted tents in the place of the République to ask for housing. The police intervened with kicking and clubbing the migrants and threatened to dislodge everyone, hitting everything that moved, including journalists and elected officials, and chasing migrants in the streets. The images circulated in all media, including the image of a police officer sticking out his leg to trip someone who was running away. This image have made the rounds of the media and social networks. The next day, it's not a chance for the government, it was bad luck. The next day, a black rap producer, Michel Zecler, who was returning to his studio in a fancy Parisian neighborhood, was beaten and insulted for 15 minutes by local police officers because he didn't have his mask on. He didn't have his mask on. Bad luck. A camera above his front door filmed everything, and a neighbor decided to film too. Michel and all those present in the studio were taken to the police station by a bunch of cops with clubs who then lied to justify taking them into police custody. These images were leaked and widely publicized, embarrassing the government, forcing it to suspend the policemen that were in there, and demanding Article 24. On Saturday, November 28, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators marched throughout the country, even in small provincial towns, many of them young people with slogans such as "The police are murderers," "Who protects us from the police?" or how many of us couldn't be filmed? It was too much for many people. As you know, already this summer following the assassination of George Floyd, thousands of people, especially young, have braved bans on gathering and demonstrating under the pretext of a state of health emergency. In June, 20,000 gathered in Paris and thousands more gathered in other cities. The protests in the streets against the violence of the police has been growing. This manifested itself this summer against racist violence, but not only against that. While the police are largely infected with racism and are much more willing, in fact, to attack people of color or of immigrant origin, and especially young people from working class neighborhoods, the increasingly tight control of the population in daily life. I give you an example. For example, a delivery man was killed in January during a police roadblock because he wanted to film it. So there is also repression during protest movements that have become a cause for concern for a large number of people. The fact that people film these violent acts and share them on social networks helps this awareness. The French state has been enacting more and more measures which have gradually been passed into law to control and repress the population. Identity checks, DNA records, police searches motivated by almost nothing, prohibition against going out to demonstrate wearing a balaclava over your face, or even together if the authorities judge that it's with intent to commit a violent act. There are more and more regular bans on demonstrating at all. The police use weapons that shoot rubber bullets and various grenades against demonstrators. The pretext of the fight against terrorism has been used to justify various states of emergency. For example, in 2015, after the deadly shooting in several places in Paris, made by radical Islamists. Repression has become increasingly tightened against social movements, especially since the strikes against a reform of the labor code by the socialist government of François Hollande in 2016. At that time, a whole arsenal of police began to prevent workers from demonstrating, searches, identity checks, tear gassing, blocking protesters for hours, etc. Then things got worse against the movement of the Yellow Vests. They used weapons that wounded and disfigured hundreds of people. 11,000 people were put in police custody, including 3,200 convictions, some with prison sentences, and also fines for wearing a yellow vest, etc., etc. Then, in 2019, where there was a strike and demonstrations against the pension reform, which also met each. So this movement against the pension reform also had its share of police violence orchestrated by the government. Transportation strikers were tear gassed and injured. Teachers were taken into custody. Teenagers were brought before the courts. And in companies such as the subways, the trains, and the French national education system, trade unionists and ordinary strikers were fired or taken before disciplinary boards to try to discourage any protests. These later movements have made a growing number of workers aware of the repression in the state and the role of the police, even if their anger is mainly directed against President Macron and his government, and not necessarily against the system as a whole. Even medical personnel were gassed during demonstrations after the first lockdown, and these images were quite shocking for people. In recent years, repression has also targeted environmental activists who have been placed under house arrest and prevented from demonstrating, and especially against high school students who are increasingly subject to beatings, police custody. For example, 15-year-old high school students were held in police stations for 30 hours recently. There are court sentences when they blockade and demonstrate in front of their schools to protest against social injustice, against labor law, or supporting yellow jackets, etc. These young people, who in France have often been a trigger for social movements, are subject to violence from the authorities and will have to learn to defend themselves and fight in these contexts. Perhaps you remember the images of dozens of high school students kneeling in front of their high school in a Parisian suburb with their hands behind their head and silenced by the police. The scene was filmed, and you can hear a policeman saying, "At last, there's one class that's behaving itself." This also shocked the people to see these images. And recently, the high school students who were mistreated by the police forces were simply protesting, often with their teachers, against the insufficient sanitary measures in school. The cartoon went so far as to say that there was no soap in the bathrooms in this COVID sequence. But the Ministry of Education claimed that everything was safe. Other targets of police permanent violence are migrants, of course, Africans, refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea. They regularly see their makeshift camp dismantled, their belongings ransacked, they are chased away without any prospect of housing, and have to wander to settle elsewhere. The state of sanitary emergency and the containment measures linked to COVID have allowed even more police checks in the streets, 5 million controls at all, and a torrent of fines, as said Jill, and those who did not wear masks. Lots and lots and hundreds and thousands of fines of 135 euros, which is huge for working class people. There is no doubt that these fines affected the working classes, those who had to go to work every day by public transit or on the roads rather than the nice neighborhoods. They are part of a whole system that aims to make the population feel guilty and be considered as such, while big business does whatever it wants in the workplaces and applies only the minimum sanitary measures. So, as said Jill, is to distract attention from the health scandal in hospitals and retirement homes. The last event that allowed the government to feel comfortable passing even more repressive measures into law was the recent assassination of the professor Samuel Paty in a Parisian suburb by a radical Islamist, followed by a bombing in the city of Nice, which also resulted in deaths. Under the pretext of defending the values of the Republic and the secularism, the government proposed a bill to the Assembly that would arrest Islamic extremists, track down those who might follow their ideas, or ban organizations deemed to be terrorists. This bill is intended more to flatter a reactionary electorate, that of extreme right, because the presidential elections are coming up, than by pointing, for example, the finger at the Muslim community and all those supposedly belonging to it, than to really fight against the fascist Islamic current. It is also the situation created by these radical Islamist attacks that made the government feel comfortable to propose the global security law. So to finish, fortunately, the government had bad luck. And now, because of all these images that was seen by many, many people in all France, and now they faced big protests. And we hope that this will continue, because the social crisis that is already underway, the unemployment that has hit hundreds of thousands more workers since the first lockdown, will continue to worsen, and reactions will be needed. The big capitalist groups are announcing new plans for layoffs every day with the excuse of the COVID-19. it is with the understanding that this is ahead that the government is reinforcing its repressive arsenal because it fears the social protests that we hope will develop. Okay, so
Thank you,
thank you.
Maria. Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you. Yes, we sure do hope they develop. So you've given all three of us, you've given us the opportunity for a really lively discussion now. We're going to start the discussion. I already have two people on staff.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was a great presentation. My question was really about how, obviously we've seen the yellow vests, the strike against the pension reforms and the protest against Adama's death, and I'm sure many others, obviously. So I'm kind of curious how, with all of these protests, and really it just seems like a rising tide of struggle, how I guess people's consciousness has been changing, and also just how many protesters today have been influenced by these past protests and strikes and everything that's happening, because it seems like there's really just an increasing tide of struggle in France especially.
Excellent. Shall our speakers take it away? Or I'll let Sarah ask her question, and we'll hold on to Aiden's question and then let you answer. Go ahead, Sarah. Why don't you ask your question?
Sorry, it wasn't allowing me to unmute. And thank you so much for the presentations. They were really interesting. Laura, I was wondering, you talked about at your workplace when the administrators were gone, there was a time period where the workers were really responsible for making a lot more of the decisions. And I was wondering if you could say more about that and the kinds of decisions that you had to take and how those were made, and then the conversations that that led to with your coworkers, and maybe what happened when the bosses eventually came back. And then I was wondering, Laura and Maria, if both of you could talk about at your workplaces what people are saying about the current ongoing protest movement and how they're relating to it, if any of them are participating in the conversations that you're having. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, our speakers, Laura and Maria and Gilles, feel free to jump in to respond now.
Mm-hmm. I maybe can start to respond to the two questions at the same time, maybe. And well, about people in the workplaces, for example, in my place, what I know is that since the yellow vest movement, for example, many people change their view of the state repression or violence. I mean, even I had some colleagues that said, "Oh, I'm very ashamed of being French," things like this. Like they didn't figure before the government could be so violent on people, beating people in demonstrations, because during the movement of the yellow vests, of course, that was quite popular. Of course, it was not a movement, for example, in Paris, that included many people from the big workplaces. Okay, people that are organized in unions and everything. It was more people coming from little workplaces, or, for example, in my workplace, there were maybe three persons going to the demonstrations, but not more. But people saw it with sympathy and thought it was really, they had revendications. It was really for social justice, it was really good. So the violence that the government used against the demonstrations were really seen as something, maybe something new. Even for us, it's not a surprise. But nowadays, for example, my colleagues, today I went to the demonstrations with only one person, because the other were quite afraid about the police, and so they don't go to the demonstrations. I mean, in fact, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of policemen in the streets. So it's frightening for people, right? So what is interesting, it's that you see so many young people that are not afraid to go there. That is the thing that is really interesting and new. So I will stop, and maybe the other comrades will say something.
Can we hear from Laura about the administration leaving and also about the change in consciousness?
Yes. So it was an example from the first wave. It was in time during all the managers were on a meeting together with the direction of the hospital and so on. And so all the teams of the COVID units were like lost to their questions. And so it was I think like everywhere, but it was a new virus. So we didn't know it. We didn't know really what was the equipment to not have the virus. And we just share some technical that we invented for look after the patients and to take care of them without having the virus. And it was a time where we didn't have so much mask for the healthcare worker. And my colleagues, I was in a COVID unit, and my colleagues were like, but where do the masks are, comment on dit, fabriqués?
Masks were made.
Yes, we have to check this factory. We have to call the factory and make them doing some masks for everyone. We live in a country where we are quite developed with a developed industry, and so it was not a workers' power, but it was quite of I can't explain, but it was like. If we had the power, we could decide of what we want to us and for the population. And even in the hospital, it was like one day we tried one way to do the cares with the equipment of protection, and the other day the team of the afternoon thought about a new way to do it, and we just shared the tricks. And it was like a collective emotion about what we could do together. And it for me, maybe it's just an impression, but I've seen a lot of friends in a lot of colleagues who had some kind of reflections that we have just as activists, and yeah, it was just a way of thinking, but for me it was like it shows the capacity of the workers to have great idea about their work, better idea than the managers, because they were like out of what we do at daily work. So, and the patient were
We understand you, Laura. That was great.
Ooh.
Thank you. That's very inspiring and exciting to hear about that. We're going to take...
I could just add something about Aidan's question. And all those movements we have seen for 4 years, I would say. It's very difficult to analyze or to summarize all those movements, but just a few remarks, and it could also be interesting to compare what's going on in France or in other European countries or in the US. But just a few remarks about those movements and the evolutions in class consciousness. First, those movements are composed or by many new people, I would say, workers who haven't been striking before, young people, many young people in the current demonstrations in France. Then, second thing, they are not really organized, or I would say there is something spontaneous in many movements. For example, the Yellow Vest, it was something very spontaneous, but even the strike last year against the pension reform, the one of the most appreciated slogan was the strike belongs to the strikers. And it's also interesting to see that they are not totally those movements organized by trade unions or political organizations. Something more, it's that the people who participate to these movements, they are quite determined. They want to obtain something, and so they see all the limits of let's say the strategy deployed by trade unions, for example. Something more is that it's what's striking in all those movements, Yellow Vest or even the pension reform strike, is that the demands or the things people are fighting for are not really very clear. It's as if people were just reacting or rejecting things, but what people claim, this is not very clear. For example, we have seen in June those huge gathering of people against police violence, and one of the most famous slogan was "No justice, no peace." Exactly the same as in the US, but it was like a sign of politicization of people who reject many aspects of the capitalist society. So I would say that those movements are a kind of expression of a social feeling in the society today, but it doesn't mean everything is easy. And I would just point some problems we have. For example, the fact that all those movements, Yellow Vest, movements against racism, or the current movement against the global security law, all those movements are unusual. It's not a problem for revolutionary activists, but they are unusual. People, they don't participate necessarily as workers. Sometimes they don't see the fact that there are still, even if those movements are important, they are a minority, and a minority has to grow and to expand. So the problem we have, and we could also exchange about that, about the situation in France and in the US, is what's to be done to go further, how can we fight against the rich, the capitalism? How can we make those movements wider, and how can we organize during those in those movements? Because if people don't organize on workplaces, what's to be done to go further? What's the next step? All those problems are we are facing all those problems during those movements. But if you have some advice, it's interesting to see. But for example, just a last word. Today we have seen the third wave of demonstrations against this security law. we as a revolutionary communists has many things to say about the police, its role in the capitalist society. But what's next? What's to be done next? It's sure now we will see new demonstrations next Saturday. But how can we prepare it? So just the kind of problem we have, good problems we have now.
Thank you, Gilles, and thank you to all of you. So next up, we have Mariah, I believe, and then Ray and Meg will ask their questions, and then we'll let the speakers respond. So Mariah, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. It's really exciting to hear about the protests, and also it's exciting to see that it's not the protests seems to not be happening only in France alone, but there's like multiple protests are taking place all throughout the world. They can picture Peru and also India and Guatemala. And my question is a bit related to that, and also the fact that when there was the George Floyd protest here, it also impacted other places throughout the world. So first question is, if the protests are happening in France, do you guys see it impacting other countries in Europe or even other countries in the world in general? And if you guys have any information about that. And the other side of this question is also, if the people who you guys are talking to who are protesting in the streets, do you think they are also taking inspiration from the other things that are happening throughout the world? And if so, in what ways? And so on. That's my question. Thank you so much.
Great question. Now, Ray, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask yours?
Hi, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences. My question is pretty similar to Sarah's, what Sarah was trying to get at. I'm curious, like, if the hospital workers are talking at all about the racism or the protests, or if there's like any talk at all about, whatever they might be taking action in as a group of workers, like doing it in the name of like, well, we're also like in solidarity with these protests that are also happening. Thank you.
Great question. And then the last question I'll take before we let them answer is from Meg.
Hi. Yes, thank you all so much for talking. I think it's really comforting is not the right word, but it feels very unifying to hear that, the situation that we're dealing with in the US is also, it's a global, international problem caused by COVID, but also beyond that, I think like just the, capitalist exploitation that is around all of us. So it's really inspiring to hear what you all have been doing. And I think my first question was sort of specific to Laura, but to everybody as well, which is just what's the level of information that is being shared? Is there any coordinated information about COVID that is being shared? Especially I've found, I also work in the healthcare system, and I've found it's just shocking how little information, nurses and doctors are getting on the situation or how to deal with it. And Laura spoke to that a little bit about just kind of coming up with things on the fly. And it feels really similar. Like there's not even a way to make an informed decision aside from trial and error. And I think that's really problematic. So I'm curious whether there within that healthcare structure, there's a way that people are coordinating how that information gets shared. But then expanding that too, and I think this goes to what Gilles was saying, with just coordination in general and sort of what to do next. How do we organize within these protests? Is there coordination? Are there like these sort of ways of distributing information across the different protests in a way, or different workplaces in a way that we can, organize more specifically? Thank you.
All right. Why don't you go ahead and answer? We've got the question about inspiring people in other countries and getting inspiration from the struggles of people in other countries, and then hospital workers and how they're reacting to the protests and the racism, as well as what Meg just brought up.
maybe I can start about the first question, because well, what is really amazing, and well, it's not so amazing, is that in this situation of crisis in the world, and even before the COVID lockdowns and everything, there were already movements in many countries against lack of democracy and things like this, and in Sudan, in Hong Kong and many places in Lebanon, and also because there is a economic crisis which leads many people to more misery and poverty and everything. So all this situation is worldwide, and it's not so. In Algeria also there was a big movement against non-democratic government, the dictatorship and everything. So you see, and because of economic crisis also. So it's not so surprising that these movements take place in many countries. But the problem is that people see it in the media. They see, for example, there was a big strike in India, for example. I had colleagues that sent me, oh, you see, in India, there was a big strike. What is going on there and everything? So people see it and they feel like, okay, it's not just us. This thing is global. But the contradiction in this is that the political solutions are reactionary and nationalists, and not only from the right and the extreme right. That is the problem. Because, for example, here in France, but I think not just in France, the left, the left-wing parties, they have nationalist solutions, and like even explaining to people that we could maybe return to a regime that was before, with a little capitalism, wealth going well, in France, with French factories, French economy, and not this global economy and everything. So it's very nationalist solutions that they give to people, and so the political. The political solutions for people are not. They see what goes on in other countries, but the solidarity, the working class solidarity, all this conscience that we should be striking together, or at least having links on everything, is not something that is put out by any party. Except us, and we are very little. Even, for example, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party in France, that is really reformist and that has just deputies and nothing else. They have workers, but they don't have a real policy, not a revolutionary one anyway. So it's just the revolutionary organizations that are little, at least for the moment, that have. Make this link and say that the working class among the world and the young people and that are fighting it could have a link, but the others push everybody, to the nationalist and reactionary solutions. So that's why there is a big contradiction in this situation, in the head of people, because they think, even if, for example, I finished with this. For the yellow vests, for example, for many people in the yellow vests that call themselves revolutionary, they say, oh, we would need a revolution. But what do they put, for example, as a solution? Some of them, we need a real republic, with a constitution that would be a good one. They don't like capitalism, but they think that maybe a good constitution and good laws would solve the problem, and a good president, a good president would solve the problem. That is the problem we have,
Thank you. And now we'll have Laura answer the questions about the hospital workers.
Yeah. On this situation, there is a lot of discussions about the global security law, and my colleagues are in two ways. They are like we have to wear a mask. We have to be at home, and so those guys are going to demo, and so they are responsible of the transmission of the virus. It's one team, more on the nurses, and the other team is more the nurse assistants. I don't know the name. The people who help the nurse.
Yes, you've got it right.
Yes, and they are for. They say yes. We are against the police violence, and so they have to go on demo, and that's okay. But in hospital for us is we work during the weekend, so not a lot of people from hospital are going to demo. This afternoon, I was with a nurse colleague during the demo. She was like, "But where are the nurses? Now it's the time for fight against the police violence, but also to fight for us, for our wages, for have more people in the hospital." And for the communication, maybe it was the question, during the first wave, I've built a little WhatsApp group with people from different units, and it was for have the information of what are the protocols, what do we have to do in this situation, because as you said, the bosses, the managers, there was no communication between the direction and the teams on the fields. And there is maybe the emergency services group after the strike of the emergency services, and they do some information on social media now, and they talk about the situation, and a lot of colleagues are following them, and so they talk about the hospital problem, and when there's a new government position about the healthcare workers, they are discussing this kind of decision, and it's like okay, but it's general, like national thing. And in a local way, in my hospital, we do leaflets, and where we speak about the situation in our units, and we try in that way to build a group on the hospital to have the information and to be able to fight when it will be the time, because now even if we are out of the second wave of COVID, we are like tired at work. I don't know. There was a big after the first wave, it was really like, now we have to go on the streets. Now it's not possible to have this low wages. We have to go on the street. And so we made the 16th of June. And it was, this time we go out, and they don't go on Zimo now. So I don't know if I answer.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, you answered. I'm sorry. So Stefania goes first, and following Stefania, I have something from Kyle and then Claudette. All right, Stefania, take it away.
Hi, this is for Laura, and Laura, you're doing great. So please don't think we're not understanding everything you're saying. I work in biotech research, and we're working on COVID therapeutic. And we hear news from other companies throughout the world, but I haven't heard anything from any French company. Is there any research going on in France? Thank you.
All right, before Laura answers that question, we'll take the question from Kyle.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentations. My main reaction listening to them is just actually how similar the social situation is in many ways in France to the United States, with the complete lack of a response in terms of COVID, how the crisis has intensified. And then also, since the summer, a real kind of you have instances of seeing like real racial divisions in France. It's around the question of the role that Muslims are playing in the society. Obviously, in the United States, it was the response to the murder of George Floyd. So I think we can really begin to see, the similarities that we're all facing across the world, regardless of what country we're living in. We're living under an international system, and the governments that we all live under use the same tactics to divide people by race, the same tactics of having a very repressive police force to maintain the inequality. So I think I completely agree with what Maria was saying, and we have to think about this in an international framework and not get caught up in the kind of bubble of our national situation, even though it's important. And connected to that, I think in the United States, one of the main things that a lot of us have been going through this year is this kind of process of racial reckoning and racism that's a real on the front of a lot of people's mind in social movements. And I'm curious in France, if with this opposition to the police and the ways in which the government has been trying to kind of boost up anti-Muslim sentiment, I'm wondering what responses you've seen in your conversations about seeing these movements as a way to kind of unite races or see common interests that maybe different folks have with Muslims. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you take Stefania's question and Kyle's question before we go on to the next questions. Laura, do you want to talk about what research you see in France on COVID-19 or respond to what Kyle just described, or any three of you could respond to Kyle?
Maybe I can say something. I can try to just say something about this. There is a big company in France, for medical research that is called Sanofi. It's a huge one. I don't know if it's not the biggest in the world, of course, but it's a big one among the world. And the Sanofi and maybe others, I don't know, but I think yes, are also trying to have a vaccine. I mean, with the Institut Pasteur, and they also, but maybe they are a little late, not like Putin's Sputnik 5 or American one and English one. So, but they are also trying to have a vaccine. And this huge company is well known in France for, well known. The workers of Sanofi, that for years and years, they have problems of layoffs, even searchers, big problems of layoffs. There were strikes and searchers, people high level, educated, that took their card to the CGT, which is the union, which is seen in France like the most struggle, class struggle and everything. Even searchers got to CGT to strike, to struggle against these layoffs. And this huge company has big benefits. The government gives money to them, and they are the kings here. And the layoffs are not a problem for the French state. And there was an episode during the first wave of COVID in France, because the chloroquine this thing that should be pretendingly, making a miracle about COVID, this chloroquine. Everybody that took chloroquine could be, in good wealth. This big pharma company is producing chloroquine at a big level. So there was some a part of the how doctors here, some doctors, well-known doctors, that went to all the media, talking about anything and saying that with the chloroquine of Sanofi, everybody could. And so there were the government was lying about the COVID because it was almost nothing, not very dangerous, and with chloroquine. So we think even this could be the influence maybe of this company. But I wanted above all to say about these layoffs, because they intend to make more layoffs, as we all know that now the research, the medical research needs many people. So
thank you very much, Maria, for that. Now we will have, finally, because we're getting close to the end of our discussion, we'll have Claudette and then Axe and then Drew speak, and then we'll let our speakers wrap it up. Go ahead, Claudette, you can unmute yourself.
Hello. I'm very impressed with what the French people have been mobilizing around. It's very encouraging to see. We have right now, of course, the Black Lives Movement, which is also spontaneous and has not developed a national organization to solidify its organizing. But we have had times in our past in the United States where the civil rights movement, for example, was able to coalesce. But there was, of course, the NAACP, which at that time had been a certain base. But other organizations were brought in. And the environmental movement in the United States has an approach of what's called the Green New Deal, and which is create new jobs to replace the industries that are decreasing, such as oil, which is a big thing in the United States, or other kinds of things like that. So I'm wondering if that works in the space of France, or do you have also the same problem we have here, which is that the nonprofits have taken over the social organizing space, which of course have a limited perspective.
Very interesting question. Thank you. How about now, Axe, your question? Can you unmute yourself?
What? Okay.
Great.
All right. Sorry, I got muted and unmuted. But anyway, thank you for this presentation. It's really interesting to me to hear, what this response has been. I was listening to the news, and in Nigeria, there has been this movement against police violence. And one demonstration of young people got opened fire on by the military, and then later on the police joined in. And somebody who was being interviewed, was reflecting that, people were discovering that their country is not a democracy, but it's a dictatorship. And to me, that just rings true, thinking globally that the dictatorship of the rich, is making the workers pay for the crisis. And the police violence is like the most immediate, expression of that. And I know that, France is not Algeria, and neither is the US, but, the responses by the government are different, but also the population has different traditions, and it responds differently. So I'm curious, how has the awareness of people in the streets and those in the workplaces, you said something about, these images that circulate on social media. But yeah, I'm curious if you feel like that awareness has shifted a little bit. I know from my coworkers this summer, people were watching what was being said on the media and just seeing the protesters as looters and watching the police response, a lot of people were very hesitant to go to these demonstrations with me. But I think people really did appreciate, what I was able to bring back into the workplace as far as, talking, well, actually, most people are not looters. So anyway, thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll let Drew ask the final question or make the final comment, and then we'll let our speakers take it away.
Pressure's on. What's up, guys? Thanks a lot for your presentations. It was really interesting. And I just kind of had a comment in response to what we were talking about earlier with Laura, with your reflections of management having gone from the hospital, and then you guys had to figure out what to do and using your, professional skills, like you said, and people just managing what the situation people found themselves in, coming up with their own solutions in a democratic way. It's like here in California now, we're again on the lockdown. The Bay Area is like another month of a lockdown. And the entire response of our government, pretty much on every level, I think you could say, it's just been beyond inadequate, And we could think about, the people at the big companies who are losing their jobs, and then you could think about all the people in the small, mom and pop places who are also at risk of totally going bankrupt and losing their livelihood as well. Look at all the small businesses that have just been, totally annihilated. And, restaurants, people were on the news last night talking about, I spent $15,000, trying to come up with this outdoor setting. And, now they're on lockdown again. So everything's closed for a month. And the point being is, where's the organized response? And certainly it's not from the government, but if we were able to take, the example that we saw at your hospital and other places, when people relied on themselves and, okay, what are we going to do? And if we're able to start building our own organizational, resources, to really impose, what we need, think about all the money that we have, we could apply to, okay, you're not able to go to work and do that same type of work, but, keep your mask on, and we're going to go out in the neighborhood and we're going to clean up the streets, and we're going to help people at the food banks, and all of these things that are obviously common sense, but it relies on more of our own initiative. So I just wanted to make that comment. So thanks again.
Thank you, Drew. All right. Maria, Gilles, and Laura, why don't you give us your final words and respond to Claudette and to Axel?
To Claudette, maybe I cannot respond because I don't know if I understood exactly what was your question about environmental problems. So maybe Gilles understood better, but I can maybe answer about what the comrade said about the Muslim people here in France and when there are all the attacks about this law of separatism against the Muslim community and all the workers that are supposed to are in this community, because there are Arabic workers and coming from North Africa that are not Muslims. Well, almost all the people today have a religion because there is a social pressure about this, a real social pressure. But anyway, as many workers are in France from Morocco, from Algeria, from Turkey and everything, we all almost, at least in Paris and big cities, we all have colleagues that are immigrants from these countries that are Muslims that work with us and feel so much pressure when there is this radical Islamist attacks. And in workplaces, it depends where you are, because there are places where you live the racism with your colleagues, and there are other places, like for example in the Post, in my workplace, we don't feel the racism. So I think it really depends where you work, where you are, if there is unions or not, because we have also we talk about people about the fact that the aim of the government is to divide people, and we don't have to, of course, say that the problem is the Muslims, but these radical movements, these Islamic movements that even in France are linked to the extreme right, movement. For example, in France, I don't know if you know that, but there are people that are linked to the Muslim radical Islamic movements that are also linked to the extreme right of Front National or Rassemblement National. They have links. In fact, they have the same interest to divide people. And the French state and the French government plays with this. So we have all these discussions with our colleagues, and it's well received, of course, differently. But for example, in my workplace, I don't feel really attention about this. People think it's disgusting. Many people think the government discourse is disgusting. Of course, they think there has to be a solution about radical Islamists. That is the problem. They say, what to do about this? So we have to have political discussions with them. Of course, it's a problem. So, but basically, there has been a good reaction among people, not going in the way that being discriminating the Muslim people. We don't, well, it exists, but it's not global, So maybe, I don't know if I answered. And there is something also that is a problem, is that this radical Islamic movement has some influence among working class, among young people, because when they see the government having all these discriminating speeches and discourse and measures, and also maybe some workers that look at them, colleagues that look at them like, oh, you're not like me, and what should we do, and talking bad about migrants, they go towards their religion. They have this tendency. There has been this tendency for years to, it's like a refugee in your religion, in your community, because otherwise it's hostile, So this is a real problem.
Thank you. That's very interesting, Maria. Well, the question that Claudette was asking, I believe, was regarding, we have very little time left, but regarding the non-governmental organizations in France and the role that they play in organizing. Maybe Gilles, do you want to take that?
Yes, just briefly, and I would just like to share some thoughts. First, the non-profits are something totally different in France than in the US. Second difference, maybe, because you were referring to the civil rights movements. I think there is still a kind of difference between the denomination of the Black people in the 1950s or 60s and the situation we see now in France. It's not exactly the same. But as far as we discuss about as far as organization are concerned, what we meant is that we need organization in which people would be able to decide how to keep on fighting, how to continue the fight, how to keep on fighting. Just an example, it's striking who is responsible for the calling to a new demonstration next week. Actually, nobody except maybe some very small organizations. We don't have any place where people can meet and discuss and decide what they want to do to continue the fight against Macron, the government, and so on. This means places where people can meet, where they can discuss. It could be the workplaces. It's to us, it would be something normal, something obvious, but it's not the case. For instance, it doesn't mean it won't ever be, but it's not the case. But this is the need we have. It doesn't mean we don't want, or it doesn't mean organizations are not necessary or useful to propose some political perspectives, but those political perspectives need to be discussed and chose by the people who are fighting. Just an example, with no movement, what's the right thing to do when a factory is threatened, is closing? What's to be done? It is normal to demand to keep the jobs, or something else, or for example to transform the whole factory. This is a problem we have currently in the car industry. You were referring to the Green New Deal, and it reminded me that there is a factory in France, not far from Paris, where a factory for Renault, where the bosses are recently decided to shut it down, saying they would stop producing cars, but they would open a kind of what they call a refactory in English, to recycle the cars. But they want impose huge layoffs and fire many people. What can workers? What do workers want in this context? To keep the car production or something else? So all those questions are to be discussed by workers, and they need their own leadership. Maybe to summarize, this is the situation. We have very strange movements with people who are quite determined, but there is no leadership. And of course, there are some forces trying to push those movements in some electoral or other ways. I'm finishing just with that, but of course, all the movements we see everywhere, they are related. They got the same root: the capitalist society, the crisis we see the attacks from the bourgeoisie on the working class. The problem, maybe what we need is a demonstration from somewhere from some country, showing what's possible, what we can obtain by fighting. Maybe this is what we could share in the future and in the future struggles.